November 14th, 1944. The destroyer USS Abner Read disintegrated in a ball of orange flame off the coast of Leyte Gulf as a single Mitsubishi Zero fighter, trailing smoke and fire, plunged through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire that should have shredded the aircraft 1,000 feet before impact. Commander Douglas MacArthur Fowler stood on the bridge of the nearby destroyer USS Claxton, watching men die because American 5-inch guns firing conventional fuses had failed to stop a determined pilot willing to trade his life for a warship. Within 72 hours, everything would change. Fowler didn't know it yet, but the weapon that would transform this desperate equation was already aboard his ship, locked in the forward magazine under guards who had been told only that the new ammunition was classified at the highest levels. The shells looked identical to standard 5-inch high-explosive rounds, distinguished only by a peculiar bulbous nose cone and a small label marked VT. Variable time fuse, the paperwork claimed, though that designation was deliberate misdirection. The device actually contained a miniature radar system that would revolutionize naval warfare in ways the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to discover with catastrophic consequences. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The kamikaze threat had emerged with shocking effectiveness during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had formalized what desperate pilots had already attempted individually, the deliberate sacrifice of aircraft and pilot to sink enemy warships. The mathematics were brutally simple. A conventional bombing attack required skilled pilots, expensive training, and achieved hit rates below 5%. A kamikaze attack required only basic flight training and achieved hit rates exceeding 30% because the pilot could adjust course until impact, becoming a guided missile in an era before guided missiles existed. The psychological impact on American sailors proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Men who had endured years of combat against conventional attacks now faced enemies who could not be deterred by fear of death, who in fact sought death as the culmination of their mission. Conventional anti-aircraft doctrine assumed attackers would break off when faced with heavy fire. Kamikaze pilots flew straight through the fiercest barrages, forcing American gunners to achieve killing hits rather than mere deterrence. According to records preserved in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archives, American casualties from kamikaze attacks during the Philippines campaign exceeded all previous naval losses in the Pacific Theater. The escort carrier USS Street Low had been sunk on October 25th. The carriers Santee, Suwannee, and White Plains had been severely damaged. The cruiser Australia had been hit repeatedly. Destroyers and smaller vessels fell victim to pilots who targeted them when larger ships proved unreachable. The Imperial Japanese Navy had discovered a weapon that threatened to make American naval superiority irrelevant through sheer willingness to die. Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan, commanding a carrier task group off Leyte, filed a report that captured the desperation permeating the fleet. The kamikaze attacks represent a tactical development for which we have no adequate counter. Our fighters cannot intercept every attacker. Our anti-aircraft fire, while heavy, achieves insufficient kill rates against pilots who will not evade. We are sustaining casualties at a rate that, if continued, will make operations in the Philippines prohibitively expensive. The report reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, who understood that the kamikaze threat represented more than a tactical problem. If American losses continued at current rates, the planned invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa would require casualty estimates that might prove politically unsustainable. The proximity fuse, that secret weapon that had been restricted to European and Mediterranean theaters for fear of compromise, and suddenly became essential to Pacific operations, despite the risk of Japanese recovery and analysis. On November 10, 1944, Nimitz authorized unrestricted use of VT fuses against Japanese aircraft. The decision reversed 18 months of carefully maintained security protocols, but the strategic calculation had shifted. American intelligence assessed that Japan lacked the industrial capacity and scientific infrastructure to replicate proximity fuse technology, even if they captured intact examples. The immediate tactical benefit of saving American ships and lives outweighed the theoretical risk of technological compromise. The authorization reached ships off Leyte within 48 hours, accompanied by terse instructions that revealed nothing about the fuse's actual function. Gunnery officers were told only to load the VT ammunition when engaging aircraft, and to expect dramatically improved performance. The secrecy reflected lingering concerns about security, but also practical recognition that explaining miniature radar systems to gun crews in the middle of combat operations served no useful purpose. The weapons would speak for themselves. November 19th, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Edmund Daly stood in the Combat Information Center aboard the light cruiser USS Montpelier as radar operators tracked a formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. The morning had dawned clear and hot over Leyte Gulf, conditions that favored kamikaze attacks by providing excellent visibility for pilots seeking targets among the American fleet supporting MacArthur's ground forces ashore. Montpelier's captain had received the VT fuse authorization the previous evening. The ship's magazines now held 3,000 rounds of the new ammunition, enough for sustained action against multiple attacks. Daly, responsible for coordinating the ship's anti-aircraft defense, understood only that these rounds represented something revolutionary. The chief gunnery officer had briefed him tersely. Load VT, engage normally, don't ask questions about how they work, just watch what happens. The Japanese formation, 23 aircraft according to radar count, split into smaller groups as they approached the fleet. Standard kamikaze doctrine called for dividing American defensive fire by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The tactic had proven effective during previous raids, overwhelming escorts while allowing several aircraft to penetrate to high-value carriers and support ships. At 8,000 yards, Montpelier's 5-inch batteries opened fire. Daly watched the first salvo through binoculars, expecting the familiar pattern of dark smudges blooming at preset altitudes, creating a lethal zone that aircraft might or might not fly through. Instead, the shells seemed to explode with uncanny precision near the lead aircraft. A Zero fighter trailing a streamer that identified its pilot as a kamikaze volunteer disintegrated as 3 shells detonated within 50 feet of the fuselage, their fragments shredding the aircraft's structure with surgical efficiency. The effect multiplied as more guns joined the barrage. Japanese aircraft that should have penetrated to within 1,000 yards before facing concentrated fire instead fell from the sky at 3,000 and 4,000 yards, torn apart by airbursts that tracked them through evasive maneuvers. The proximity fuses were detecting targets with their miniature radar systems and detonating at mathematically optimal ranges, turning each shell into a precision-guided weapon. Within 12 minutes, 18 of the 23 attacking aircraft had been destroyed. The remaining 5, their formation shattered and their pilots' resolve tested by the slaughter they'd witnessed, turned away without pressing attacks. Not a single American ship sustained damage. The battle, if it could even be called that, represented the most lopsided anti-aircraft engagement in naval history to that point. Daly stood in stunned silence as the last Japanese aircraft disappeared beyond the horizon. The deck around him was littered with spent shell casings, the air thick with cordite smoke, but his ship remained untouched. Men who had braced for the familiar terror of watching kamikazes crash through defensive fire, instead cheered and embraced, struggling to comprehend what they'd just witnessed. The combat action report filed by Montpelier's captain, preserved in National Archives records, captured the revolution in clinical language that barely concealed the writer's astonishment. VT-fused ammunition performed beyond all expectations. Observed hit rates approximately 10 times conventional fuses. Enemy aircraft destroyed at ranges that would normally permit continued approach. Recommend immediate expanded deployment and authorization for all anti-aircraft batteries. Across the fleet off Leyte, similar scenes repeated throughout November as more ships received VT fuse allocations and engaged kamikaze attacks. The destroyer USS Aulick fired 47 VT-fused rounds and claimed 7 aircraft destroyed. The battleship USS Mississippi, whose massive 5-inch secondary battery could put enormous volumes of fire into the air, devastated an entire kamikaze formation without suffering a single hit. The cruiser USS Louisville, which had been damaged by a kamikaze just weeks earlier, emerged unscathed from multiple attacks after receiving VT ammunition. The statistical impact of proximity fuses manifested immediately in fleet casualty reports. During the first 3 weeks of November, before VT deployment, kamikaze attacks achieved a hit rate of 28% against ships they targeted. During the last week of November, after widespread VT deployment, the hit rate dropped to 9%. By early December, as more ships received allocations and gunnery officers learned to employ the new ammunition effectively, kamikaze success rates fell below 5%. The human cost differential was staggering. Ships that would have been hit and potentially sunk instead remained operational. Sailors who would have died from kamikaze impacts instead survived to continue fighting. The cumulative effect of VT fuses began shifting the tactical balance in the Pacific from a crisis that threatened to make American naval operations unsustainable to a problem that could be managed through technology and firepower. But the revolution remained invisible to Japanese commanders, who received only fragmentary reports from pilots who survived missions and returned with descriptions of impossible American anti-aircraft fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus, already strained by American submarine interdiction and code-breaking, failed to recognize that a fundamental technological change had occurred. They attributed increased American effectiveness to improved gunnery training, better radar fire control, or simple luck. The failure to understand proximity fuses would cost Japan dearly in the coming months. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet and architect of expanded kamikaze operations, reviewed attack reports in his headquarters on Kyushu during early December 1944 with mounting frustration. Pilot losses had increased dramatically, while successful strikes against American shipping had declined proportionally. The Americans seemed to have developed some new defensive technique, but surviving pilots provided contradictory descriptions that defied clear analysis. Some pilots reported that American shells appeared to explode near aircraft without any visible trigger, as though proximity alone caused detonation. Others insisted that American radar must have achieved impossible accuracy, guiding every shell to within lethal range. A few survivors whispered that the Americans had developed explosive bullets of incredible power, though this explanation violated everything Japanese aviation engineers understood about ballistics and explosives. Ugaki, a veteran of carrier operations and conventional naval warfare, struggled to make sense of reports that seemed to defy physics. Japanese naval doctrine held that anti-aircraft shells required preset fuses that detonated at specific altitudes. Gunners estimated target altitude, set fuses accordingly, and fired barrages that created zones of lethal fragments through which enemy aircraft had to fly. The system worked adequately against level bombers flying predictable courses at constant altitudes. It worked poorly against diving attackers or low-flying torpedo planes, and it certainly shouldn't achieve the hit rates Americans were demonstrating against kamikaze aircraft. According to documents captured after the war and preserved in the Gordon Prange collection at the University of Maryland, Ugaki convened a conference of technical experts on December 8 to investigate the increased American anti-aircraft effectiveness. The assembled officers and engineers represented Japan's most knowledgeable specialists in naval warfare and aviation, yet their conclusions revealed a fundamental inability to imagine the technology that was destroying Japanese aircraft. Captain Toshikazu Omei, a staff officer with extensive technical expertise, presented an analysis that typified Japanese thinking. American radar fire control has clearly improved in recent months. They are tracking our aircraft more accurately and coordinating their defensive fire more effectively. We must adjust tactics to exploit any remaining vulnerabilities in their system. Low-altitude approaches from multiple directions simultaneously will overwhelm their ability to concentrate fire. The recommendations flowing from this analysis emphasized tactical adaptation rather than recognition that the Americans had deployed revolutionary technology. Japanese pilots received orders to approach targets at wavetop level, where radar tracking proved more difficult and where the curvature of the Earth provided some protection from detection. Attacks should come from multiple directions simultaneously to divide defensive fire. Aircraft should make final approach runs at maximum speed to minimize time spent in the engagement envelope. All these tactical adjustments had merit against conventional anti-aircraft systems. None addressed the actual problem that American ships were firing shells equipped with miniature radar systems that detected targets and detonated automatically at optimal ranges. The proximity fuse didn't care whether aircraft approached at high altitude or sea level, from one direction or many. Physics and electronics operated with remorseless efficiency, regardless of tactical variations. The Japanese failure to comprehend proximity fuses reflected broader limitations in their scientific and industrial infrastructure. Germany, despite similar technological backwardness in radar development, at least possessed sophisticated electronics industries and research institutions capable of analyzing captured Allied equipment. Japan's scientific establishment, while competent in many areas, lacked the depth of expertise in microwave technology and miniaturized electronics that would have enabled them to recognize what they faced. Even if Japanese engineers had somehow captured an intact VT fuse and subjected it to laboratory analysis, the industrial capacity to replicate such devices simply did not exist. Japan's electronics industry struggled to produce adequate vacuum tubes for conventional radio equipment. The notion of manufacturing miniature vacuum tubes hardened to withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity, then installing them in proximity fuses to be expended as artillery ammunition, exceeded Japan's industrial capabilities by orders of magnitude. Lieutenant Fuso Kawai, a naval aviation officer who survived multiple kamikaze missions before his squadron was disbanded, recorded his observations in a diary that was later recovered and translated by American occupation forces. His entries from late 1944 captured the bewilderment felt by pilots who faced proximity fuses without understanding what killed their comrades. December 15th. Today we lost 8 aircraft attacking American ships off Mindoro. Veteran pilots with hundreds of hours' experience, all destroyed before reaching their targets. The Americans fire shells that seem to know where our aircraft are flying. Lieutenant Shimizu was torn apart by an explosion that occurred 30 meters from his wing, though he was taking violent evasive action. How do their shells follow him? Our intelligence officers insist there must be some logical explanation, but no one can tell us what it is or how we should counter it. The diary continued through January and February of 1945, documenting mounting losses and declining morale as Japanese pilots confronted an enemy whose anti-aircraft capabilities seemed supernatural. Kawai's final entries, written shortly before his own death in March, revealed a fatalism born from facing impossible odds. We fly, knowing that death is certain, but we expected to at least reach our targets before dying. Now we die in the sky, far from the enemy, killed by weapons we cannot see or understand. This is not the honorable death we were promised. January 9th, 1945. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi stood aboard the carrier Amagi, anchored in the inland sea near Kure, supervising the loading of aircraft that would never return. As senior staff officer for the 1st Air Fleet's kamikaze operations, Inaguchi bore responsibility for transforming the Special Attack Corps from desperate improvisation into systematic doctrine. The previous 3 months had taught him that courage and sacrifice, while abundant among Japanese pilots, could not overcome the mysterious American defensive capabilities that were systematically destroying his forces before they reached their targets. The statistics were damning. During October 1944, kamikaze attacks had achieved a 28% hit rate, sinking or damaging American vessels with frequency that threatened to disrupt their operations. By January 1945, that rate had collapsed to below 6%. Japanese pilots were dying in unprecedented numbers while inflicting diminishing damage on the enemy fleet. Something fundamental had changed in the tactical equation, but Inaguchi and his staff remained blind to what that change actually was. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had conceived the kamikaze strategy and bore its moral weight, met with Inaguchi on January 12th to review the deteriorating situation. According to records preserved in the Japanese Defense Agency archives, their conversation revealed the depth of Japanese incomprehension about proximity fuses and the strategic implications of that technological blind spot. The Americans have improved their defensive fire, Onishi stated, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man watching his strategy crumble. But we must continue attacks regardless of casualties. Japan's survival depends on making the invasion of our homeland so costly that the Americans will negotiate rather than fight to the end. Every ship we sink, every landing craft we destroy, every American sailor we kill brings us closer to that negotiated peace. Inoguchi understood the logic but questioned whether the mathematics still supported the strategy. "Admiral, we are losing 8 aircraft for the decollage, every successful hit. Our pilot training program cannot replace losses at this rate. By summer, we will have expended our entire air force without achieving the cumulative damage necessary to force American negotiations." The exchange illustrated Japan's strategic desperation. Kamikaze attacks represented not a choice, but the only remaining option for a nation whose conventional military forces had been systematically destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost the majority of its capital ships at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Japanese industry, hammered by American submarine blockade and strategic bombing, could not produce modern aircraft in quantities sufficient to contest American air superiority through conventional means. Suicide attacks offered the only tactical approach that might inflict damage disproportionate to resources expended, but that calculus depended on kamikaze attacks achieving hit rates that justified the sacrifice of pilots and aircraft. As American anti-aircraft effectiveness improved through proximity fuse deployment, the exchange ratio shifted decisively against Japan. The Special Attack Corps was burning through pilots faster than training programs could replace them, while the damage inflicted on American forces declined toward insignificance. What Japanese commanders could not know, what their intelligence apparatus failed to detect, was that the American advantage would only increase. Production of VT fuses accelerated throughout early 1945 as factories in the United States refined their manufacturing processes and expanded output. By February, American ships received unlimited allocations of proximity-fused ammunition. Gunners no longer rationed the precious shells or reserved them for the most threatening attacks. They fired VT fuses at every Japanese aircraft that appeared, creating defensive barriers that transformed air defense from uncertain desperation into systematic slaughter. February 16th, 1945. The American invasion of Iwo Jima commenced with a naval bombardment that demonstrated the full maturity of proximity fuse technology applied not only to anti-aircraft defense, but also to shore bombardment. Battleships and cruisers surrounding the 8-square-mile island fired VT-fused shells that detonated above Japanese defensive positions, showering fortifications with fragments that penetrated trenches and bunkers inadequately protected from airbursts. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the 22,000 Japanese troops defending Iwo Jima, had prepared his forces for a conventional bombardment by constructing deep bunkers and interconnected tunnel systems that could withstand direct hits from heavy shells. His defensive philosophy emphasized dispersal and protection, forcing Americans to dig out each position through costly infantry assault. The strategy would have worked against conventional artillery that required direct hits or ground detonations to inflict casualties. Proximity fuses undermined Kuribayashi's defensive preparations by turning American naval guns into area effect weapons that could suppress Japanese positions without requiring pinpoint accuracy. Shells detonating overhead rained fragments downward into trenches and gun emplacements, forcing defenders to retreat into their deepest bunkers and abandon prepared firing positions. The effectiveness was limited by Iwo Jima's volcanic rock and the depth of Japanese fortifications, but it established a pattern that would intensify during the Okinawa campaign. The real demonstration of proximity fuse supremacy at Iwo Jima came not from shore bombardment, but from anti-aircraft defense against the inevitable kamikaze response. On February 21st, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation Tan No. 2, committing over 100 aircraft to kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet. The scale of the attack represented Japan's largest aerial offensive since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and it achieved results that stunned Japanese commanders for entirely unexpected reasons. American radar detected the kamikaze formations while they were still 60 miles from the fleet. Combat air patrols of Hellcat fighters intercepted many aircraft before they reached the screening destroyers, but dozens of kamikazes broke through to face the fleet's anti-aircraft defenses. What followed was systematic annihilation that left surviving Japanese pilots traumatized and Japanese commanders grasping for explanations. The destroyer USS Cogswell, stationed on the fleet's outer screen, opened fire at 6,000 yards with VT-fused 5-inch shells. Within 6 minutes, Cogswell's gun crews had destroyed 11 attacking aircraft, firing 47 rounds to achieve a hit rate of 23%. The engagement demonstrated what proximity fuses had become in the hands of well-trained American gun crews, precision instruments that transformed anti-aircraft fire from probabilistic barrier into targeted execution. Across the invasion fleet, the story repeated with variations in detail but consistent results. The battleship USS Nevada, whose gunners had received extensive training with VT ammunition during transit to the operation, engaged 16 kamikaze aircraft and destroyed 14. The cruiser USS Pensacola fired VT-fused shells that devastated a formation of Mitsubishi Betties attempting a coordinated torpedo attack, splashing 9 of 12 aircraft before any reached launch range. Smaller destroyers and destroyer escorts, equipped with rapid-firing 5-inch guns and unlimited VT ammunition, created overlapping fields of fire that no Japanese aircraft penetrated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Of the 104 aircraft committed to Operation TAN No. 2, American forces destroyed 96. 53 fell to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, while the remainder were claimed by combat air patrols. 8 kamikazes reached their targets, achieving minor damage to 3 vessels and inflicting no sinking. The exchange ratio, 13 Japanese aircraft lost for every successful hit, represented a catastrophic failure that should have alerted Japanese commanders that they faced revolutionary technology. Instead, the after-action reports filed by surviving pilots and the analyses conducted by Japanese naval staff attributed American success to overwhelming fighter coverage, improved radar tracking, and concentrated defensive fire. The possibility that Americans had deployed proximity-fused shells, weapons that automatically detonated near targets through onboard radar systems, remained literally unimaginable to Japanese military planners who lacked the scientific framework to conceive of such technology. Ensign Yasunori Aoki, one of 8 pilots who survived Operation TAN No. 2, submitted a report that captured the helplessness Japanese aviators felt when facing proximity fuses. American anti-aircraft fire has achieved supernatural accuracy. Shells explode around our aircraft as though magnetically attracted. Traditional evasive maneuvers provide no protection. I witnessed Commander Nakamura's aircraft disintegrate from an explosion that occurred while he was in a steep dive, changing course rapidly. The American shell somehow predicted his position and detonated at precisely the optimal range. I cannot explain how this is possible, but I know what I saw. Aoki's report joined dozens of similar accounts that should have triggered intensive intelligence investigation. Instead, Japanese naval headquarters dismissed the descriptions as combat stress or exaggeration born from traumatic experience. The notion that American industry could manufacture millions of miniature radar systems, install them in artillery shells, and expend them as disposable ammunition exceeded the comprehension of officers whose own military struggled to produce adequate quantities of conventional weapons. March 18, 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation TAN No. 3 against American carrier forces conducting strikes on Kyushu. This attack employed nearly 200 aircraft in the largest kamikaze offensive since Leyte Gulf, representing a substantial portion of Japan's remaining operational air strength. The results would finally force Japanese commanders to confront the reality that they faced technological capabilities far exceeding their previous understanding. The American carriers Intrepid, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Wasp operated 50 miles east of Kyushu, conducting fighter sweeps and bombing raids against Japanese airfields in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa scheduled for April. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell commanded Task Force 58, the fast carrier force that had systematically destroyed Japanese naval aviation throughout the Pacific Campaign. Mitch's ships represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled, protected by combat air patrols, advanced radar systems, and most critically, unlimited supplies of VT-fused anti-aircraft ammunition. The kamikaze attack commenced at 14:30 hours on a clear afternoon that provided excellent visibility for both attackers and defenders. Japanese aircraft approached in multiple formations from different directions, attempting to overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous attacks against multiple carriers. The tactic had proven effective during earlier operations when American anti-aircraft fire could only engage limited sectors at once. Against proximity fuses, the tactic failed catastrophically. American destroyers on the outer screen opened fire at extreme range, their VT-fused shells reaching out 7,000 and 8,000 yards to splash attacking aircraft that normally would have closed to within 3,000 yards before facing concentrated fire. The carriers themselves, equipped with 5-inch guns and rapid-firing 40mm batteries, created defensive barriers that proved essentially impenetrable. The carrier Intrepid, which had been hit by a kamikaze during the Philippines campaign and repaired in time for Okinawa operations, demonstrated the transformation that VT fuses had wrought in naval air defense. Her gun crews engaged 34 separate aircraft during the 2-hour battle, firing VT-fused ammunition that destroyed 29 attackers before they reached within 2,000 yards. The 5 kamikazes that penetrated Intrepid's defensive fire all fell to the carrier's close-in weapons before achieving hits. Across Task Force 58, the slaughter continued with mechanical efficiency. The battleship South Dakota, providing anti-aircraft support for the carriers, fired over 300 VT-fused 5-inch shells and claimed 42 aircraft destroyed. The cruiser Vicksburg expended 260 rounds to kill 31 aircraft. Smaller destroyers and destroyer escorts added their fire to create a defensive network that transformed the sky around the carriers into a killing ground, where Japanese aircraft simply ceased to exist. Of the 193 aircraft committed to Operation TAN No. 3, American forces destroyed 174. Kamikaze pilots achieved exactly 4 hits against American vessels, causing moderate damage to 1 carrier and minor damage to 3 destroyers. Not a single American ship was sunk. The exchange ratio had reached 43 Japanese aircraft lost for every successful strike, a rate of attrition that rendered kamikaze operations militarily pointless, regardless of the pilot's courage or determination. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served on the staff of the combined fleet, analyzed reports from Operation TAN No. 3 with growing alarm. The pattern was undeniable. American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased by an order of magnitude since the previous autumn. The escalation could not be explained by improved training or better radar alone. Something fundamental had changed, something the Imperial Japanese Navy had failed to detect or understand. Fuchida drafted a memorandum to Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, arguing for intensive intelligence efforts to determine what new American technology was destroying Japanese aircraft with such efficiency. According to documents preserved in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, Fuchida's assessment came closer than any previous Japanese analysis to identifying proximity fuses as the source of American advantage. The enemy's anti-aircraft fire now achieves hit rates that conventional weapons systems cannot explain. Their shells detonate in proximity to our aircraft with regularity that suggests automated targeting or detection systems. We must determine whether the Americans have deployed some form of proximity-activated fuse or similar technology. If such weapons exist, our current tactical approaches are obsolete and must be revised immediately. The memorandum reached Toyoda's headquarters on March 25, 1 week after Operation TAN No. 3 and 11 days before the invasion of Okinawa would commence. By then, the window for tactical adaptation had effectively closed. Even if Japanese intelligence had confirmed proximity fuse deployment, Japan lacked the industrial capacity or scientific expertise to develop countermeasures. The electromagnetic spectrum had become an American weapon that Japan could neither detect nor counter. April 1, 1945. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, began with an amphibious assault that would trigger the largest sustained kamikaze campaign of the Pacific War. Over the next 3 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy would expend more than 1,500 aircraft in desperate attempts to sink enough American ships to force reconsideration of Japan's unconditional surrender. The mathematics of attrition, already tilted decisively against Japan by proximity fuse technology, would become utterly unsustainable as American forces refined their employment of VT ammunition during continuous combat operations. The first major kamikaze offensive against the Okinawa invasion fleet came on April 6, when nearly 400 aircraft attacked in coordinated waves designated Kikusui No. 1. Japanese commanders had learned from previous failures and attempted tactical innovations. Aircraft approached at wave-top level to avoid radar detection. Attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, and pilots were ordered to target transport vessels and support ships rather than heavily defended carriers. None of these adaptations mattered against proximity fuses. American destroyers on radar picket duty around Okinawa faced the heaviest kamikaze attacks and suffered accordingly, but their VT-fused guns still destroyed attacking aircraft at rates that prevented overwhelming the defenses. The destroyer Leyte fired 213 rounds of VT ammunition during Kikusui No. 1, claiming 17 aircraft destroyed before finally succumbing to the 18th kamikaze that crashed into her superstructure. The tragedy of Leyte and other ships that were hit during Okinawa obscures the larger reality. Proximity fuses prevented hundreds of additional strikes that would have occurred had American ships been equipped only with conventional anti-aircraft ammunition. Statistical analysis conducted by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan after the war concluded that VT fuses reduced successful kamikaze hits by approximately 70% compared to conventional fuses. In practical terms, this meant that 7 out of every 10 kamikazes that would have hit American ships were, instead, destroyed short of their targets. The human cost of that 70% difference was staggering. Thousands of American sailors who would have died aboard ships struck by kamikazes instead survived because proximity fuses destroyed attacking aircraft before impact. The calculus was coldly mathematical but profoundly moral. American industrial capacity and scientific expertise, channeled through a weapons program that cost over $1 billion, had purchased American lives with physics and engineering rather than flesh and blood. For the Japanese pilots flying those missions, proximity fuses represented a nightmare that military training and personal courage could not overcome. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa, who would eventually achieve fame by hitting the carrier Bunker Hill on May 11th in one of the war's most successful kamikaze attacks, flew 7 previous missions that were aborted or failed due to American anti-aircraft fire. His diary, recovered after his death, documented the psychological impact of facing proximity fuses without understanding what was killing his comrades. April 20th. Today I watched Ensign Nakagawa's aircraft explode 300 meters from his target, torn apart by anti-aircraft fire that seemed guided by divine intervention. He was so close to achieving his mission, yet the Americans destroyed him with a precision that defies explanation. How do their shells find us with such accuracy? I have flown through their fire 4 times now, and survived only through fortune that I cannot trust to continue. When my time comes, I pray I can reach my target before their supernatural weapons find me. Ogawa's eventual success in hitting Bunker Hill came not from any tactical breakthrough, but from simple probability. Enough kamikaze pilots attacking enough targets would eventually achieve some hits despite proximity fuses. His sacrifice and the damage he inflicted demonstrated that VT ammunition was not invincible, merely extraordinarily effective. But the exchange ratio, dozens of failed attacks for every success, rendered kamikaze operations strategically futile. By mid-May 1945, Japanese commanders privately acknowledged that kamikaze attacks were failing to achieve their strategic objective. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, whose 5th Air Fleet bore primary responsibility for kamikaze operations during Okinawa, recorded his assessment in a diary entry dated May 17th. Our Special Attack Corps has inflicted significant damage on the enemy, sinking and damaging numerous vessels. But the Americans continue to operate despite our attacks, and their invasion of Okinawa proceeds according to their schedule. We are losing pilots and aircraft at unsustainable rates, while the enemy adapts to our tactics and improves his defenses. I fear we are spending our young men's lives without achieving the strategic impact necessary to force American negotiations. Ugaki's assessment was accurate, but incomplete. He recognized that kamikaze attacks were failing strategically, but he still attributed American defensive effectiveness to factors like improved radar coordination and overwhelming fighter coverage. The fundamental technological reality that Americans were firing shells equipped with miniature radar systems that automatically detonated near targets remained beyond his comprehension, even as it destroyed his forces. The Japanese failure to understand proximity fuses stemmed partly from the weapon's very effectiveness. Successful kamikaze attacks, which might have resulted in intact VT fuses being recovered from crashed aircraft or damaged ships, became so rare that Japanese forces had limited opportunity to capture examples for analysis. The few intact fuses that did fall into Japanese hands during operations off Okinawa reached field headquarters, where officers lacked the technical expertise to recognize what they had captured. The devices were classified as damaged, conventional fuses, and set aside, their significance unrecognized. June 15, 1945. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical aviators and a principal planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, stood in the ruins of a bombed-out building near Tokyo that served as temporary headquarters for what remained of Japanese naval aviation. Around him, staff officers compiled reports from the Okinawa campaign, documenting losses that exceeded the most pessimistic predictions. The Special Attack Corps had expended over 1,600 aircraft against the American invasion fleet, achieving approximately 100 hits while suffering a kill rate above 90%. Genda, whose tactical innovations had helped Japan achieve its early war victories, now confronted a technology gap that rendered tactical brilliance irrelevant. He had finally seen intelligence reports describing the American variable time fuse, though the reports revealed little about how the weapons actually functioned. What was clear was that Americans possessed proximity-activated fuses that dramatically enhanced anti-aircraft effectiveness, and Japan had no equivalent technology nor any prospect of developing it before the war's inevitable conclusion. According to post-war interviews conducted by American intelligence officers, Genda experienced the revelation about proximity fuses with a mixture of professional admiration and bitter recognition that Japan had been outmatched not only in industrial capacity, but also in scientific sophistication. The Americans had not simply built more ships and aircraft than Japan could produce. They had transformed the fundamental physics of naval warfare through weapons that Japanese engineers could not replicate, even with captured examples to study. When I first learned that the Americans had developed proximity fuses, Genda told his interrogators in October 1945, I immediately understood why our kamikaze attacks had become so costly and ineffective. The weapon represented exactly the kind of technological surprise that determines wars. We had surprised the Americans at Pearl Harbor with tactical innovation. They had surprised us with scientific and industrial capabilities so advanced that we never imagined they existed. Our intelligence failed not through lack of effort, but through lack of imagination. The admission captured the essence of Japan's technological defeat. Japanese scientists understood physics and engineering at a theoretical level comparable to their American counterparts. Individual Japanese researchers had published papers on radar proximity detection and automated fire control systems. What Japan lacked was the industrial infrastructure, the collaborative research environment, and the massive resource commitment necessary to transform theoretical knowledge into operational weapons systems produced in quantities that mattered. America's development of the proximity fuse, that miniaturized radar system packed into artillery shells and manufactured by the millions, required not only scientific insight, but also industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's entire economy. The Crosley Corporation, Eastman Kodak, and dozens of other American companies had converted peacetime manufacturing to produce VT fuse components using mass production techniques that Japanese industry simply could not match. The weapon embodied American advantages in every dimension: scientific research, engineering, pragmatism, industrial scale, and systematic integration of technology across military branches. July 26, 1945. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Supreme Commander of the Combined Fleet, met with Emperor Hirohito to discuss Japan's military position and the impossibility of continuing effective resistance. The Okinawa campaign had ended in complete American victory, positioning invasion forces within striking distance of the home islands. Strategic bombing had devastated Japanese cities, and the naval blockade had reduced industrial production to a fraction of wartime requirements. The military situation was hopeless by any objective measure. Among the factors Toyoda cited in his assessment was the collapse of kamikaze effectiveness due to American anti-aircraft improvements that Japanese forces could neither understand nor counter. According to records from the imperial household preserved in the National Archives of Japan, Toyoda explained to the emperor that continuing kamikaze operations would sacrifice Japan's remaining pilots without inflicting damage sufficient to deter American invasion plans. The proximity fuse, though Toyoda did not use that specific term in his audience with the emperor, had effectively neutralized Japan's final desperate strategy for defending the homeland. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, forcing Japan's surrender, the decision came against a backdrop of comprehensive technological defeat that extended far beyond nuclear weapons. The proximity fuse had demonstrated that American industrial and scientific capabilities exceeded Japanese imagination even before the Manhattan Project's apocalyptic revelation. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and Naval Technical Missions to Japan documented the complete picture of how proximity fuses had shaped the Pacific War's final year. Between November 1944 and August 1945, American forces had expended over 1 million VT-fused rounds against Japanese aircraft, primarily in defense against kamikaze attacks. The weapons achieved hit rates averaging 15 to 20%, compared to 3 to 5% for conventional fuses, effectively tripling American anti-aircraft effectiveness. The cumulative impact was profound. Statistical models developed after the war suggested that had American forces been equipped only with conventional anti-aircraft ammunition during the Okinawa campaign, Japanese kamikaze attacks would likely have sunk between 30 and 40 additional ships while damaging over 100 more. The casualties from those additional strikes would have numbered in the thousands, potentially altering American willingness to conduct further amphibious operations against the Japanese home islands. Dr. Merle Tuve, director of the Proximity Fuse Development Program, reflected on the weapon's Pacific service in a lecture delivered at Johns Hopkins University in 1947. "We developed the VT fuse primarily to defend against German air attacks on Allied shipping. Its most significant service came against Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. The weapon saved thousands of American lives by destroying aircraft that would otherwise have struck our ships. But perhaps its most important contribution was psychological. American sailors knew they possessed superior technology. Japanese pilots knew they faced weapons they could not understand or defeat. That psychological dimension affected morale and tactical decision-making throughout the final year of the war." The proximity fuse's legacy extended beyond World War II into the post-war development of guided weapons and automated defense systems. The engineering challenges solved by Tuve's team miniaturization of electronics, ruggedization of delicate components, and mass production of precision instruments informed subsequent developments in radar-guided missiles, automated fire control, and eventually the electronics revolution that transformed 20th-century technology. The human stories behind those technological developments remained less visible, but equally significant. Japanese pilots who faced proximity fuses experienced technological surprise that shattered their confidence and rendered their sacrifice militarily pointless. American sailors, whose lives were saved by VT fuses, often never knew the weapon existed, classified as it was until after the war. The scientists and engineers who developed proximity fuses worked in secrecy, their contributions unrecognized until decades later, when formally classified records became available to historians. August 15, 1945. As Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast crackled over radios throughout Japan, Commander Minoru Genda stood in his office contemplating the technological gulf that had doomed his nation's resistance. Among the papers on his desk lay a technical report on American proximity fuses, finally compiled from captured examples and interrogations of American prisoners. The report confirmed what Genda had suspected. The weapons represented engineering sophistication that Japan could not have matched even with years of development time and unlimited resources. The miniature vacuum tubes that survived artillery forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity, the radar circuits that detected targets and triggered detonation in milliseconds, the manufacturing processes that produced these precision instruments by the millions at costs low enough to treat them as expendable ammunition. Every element of the proximity fuse embodied advantages that Japan had never possessed and could never have acquired through combat experience or tactical innovation. Genda's post-war career would include service rebuilding Japan's air defense forces and advising on the development of modern weapons systems. His expertise in aerial tactics would prove valuable during the creation of Japan's self-defense forces. But he never forgot the lesson of proximity fuses, that wars are won not only by courage and tactical skill, but by industrial capacity and scientific sophistication mobilized through systematic effort. The proximity fuse represented American civilization at war, pragmatic, collaborative, resource-intensive, and remorseless in its application of technology to military problems. Japanese military culture had emphasized spirit, sacrifice, and tactical brilliance. American military culture emphasized engineering, logistics, and systematic elimination of enemy capabilities through overwhelming material superiority. The clash between these philosophies determined the Pacific War's outcome as decisively as any battle. When Major Heinrich Vogel knelt beside that unexploded American shell in the frozen fields of Bastogne, discovering the secret of VT fuses, he recognized that Germany faced technological defeat. When Japanese admirals dismissed reports of impossible American anti-aircraft accuracy, refusing to imagine that such weapons could exist, they condemned their pilots to face technology that turned courage into futility. Both Axis powers learned the same bitter lesson, that imagination, bounded by existing capabilities, cannot compete with industrial democracies that transform impossible into inevitable through collaboration, resources, and systematic engineering. The proximity fuse sits today in museums across America and Japan, a silent testament to the moment when physics and electronics proved more decisive than bravery and sacrifice. Japanese admirals had dismissed the possibility of such weapons, convinced that their pilots' determination would overcome any American technological advantage. They learned otherwise as their aircraft fell from the sky in unprecedented numbers, destroyed by shells that seemed to possess awareness and intelligence. The admission came too late to matter, recognition extracted through catastrophic losses rather than tactical insight. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the largest bomb or the fastest aircraft. It's the engineering philosophy that makes complexity simple, that turns theoretical physics into disposable ammunition, that mobilizes an entire civilization's industrial and scientific capacity to protect each soldier and sailor as though their individual survival mattered more than tactical abstractions. The proximity fuse embodied that philosophy perfectly, and the Japanese Special Attack Corps paid the price for facing technology they never imagined could exist until it was destroying them from the sky. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.